I want to talk about this midterm paper a little bit before we get started talking about thesis statements. And just like kind of what generally we're going to be doing for the rest of the time before midterm, because we are almost at like the midpoint of the semester here, which is weird and terrifying.
And I went to like, the weeks to see like on your syllabus to see like what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I was like, let me just see how many weeks we have. We have 16, and I was like, oh, we're on week 7.
Yeah. Yeah, we are literally at like just about the midpoint here. But this also means that after today, there's only one more week till we get a break, right? So what I want you to do for tomorrow, right? I had initially assigned this for tonight, but because I was slow getting back to you about the exploratory reflections, I want you to complete assignment 5 on page 177. Remember that you're using reflection 1 as your starting point, and it should be about 1,000 words, right?
Okay, so do we take reflection 1 and just add on to it, or do we just take what we said, some of what we said in that, and put it in there?
I would say more the latter, right? So you're going to want to rethink and revise reflection 1 based on the comments I gave you on the exploratory reflection. Then you're going to build on that. You're going to add to that until you get to about 1,000 words, right? So remember that for the reflection, right, I only wanted you to give me the one quote and pick it out. You were just going to show me a little piece of that pattern you were seeing, right? So what I want you to start doing for this is to show me more of that pattern, right? And try to come to some conclusions about its significance, right? Why this matters. And indeed, like that's that's kind of where we're going to be going for paper 1. So I gave you the handout. I did not give you the handout yet. So we'll talk about this in just a minute. But I also want to remind everybody too that on Tuesday we're not going to meet here. We're going to go to the first floor computer lab. It's room 113. It's like, do you guys know where the classrooms are on the first floor of this building?
No.
Okay, so if you don't come upstairs, you'll see there are classrooms like along the front and back of the building. Room 113 is on the front.
Okay.
It's full of computers. In fact, you probably saw me pulling the whiteboard out of one of the classrooms. No, you didn't because I was early, yeah. But there are first floor classrooms. They're on the front and the back of the building. Room 113 is on that side.
Okay.
Just look for the computer lab with the lights on.
Okay.
And that is where we'll be meeting. And you'll have a chance to work on your paper 1 draft there and ask me questions while you're working. And Thursday, I've already sent around the Google Doc for individual conferences. I know you've already scheduled yours. So just make sure that you get that scheduled as soon as possible. You'll get 15 minutes. We'll talk about the state of your draft, what you'll need to do to finish up paper 1, and we can talk a little bit about kind of your general progress in the class as well. Okay, so any questions about anything? Everything is clear? Everything is good. Okay, great.
So again, we can use our first exploratory reflection to go for the reflection 1, or whatever you want. What I don't want you to do is take what you've already written and then just add another 500 words. I do want you to go back and revise and rethink what you've already written. And add to what you've already written, as long as
Yeah.
Add to what you've already written and then add more at the bottom.
Yeah, well, rethink and revise what you've already written, and then add more.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're still, you're starting from this work that you've already done, right? So you've already got this, and then you're going to revise that a little bit, and you're going to add to it.
Okay, it makes me feel better.
Okay, yes.
You say 1,000 words, I'm like,
well,
I don't get 500.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Like, one of the things that I'm trying to do here, by breaking this paper up into stages, is to make the whole thing a little less intimidating, right? It's easier if we start early and do it, say, 500 words at a time, than if I just give you an assignment for a 1,500 word paper and say, go do this, right? I also find that if I give you set dates to complete stages of the paper, rather than just saying this is all due, on X date, that the work I tend to get from you is better, and that you're more likely to actually finish it. So, paper 1 is going to be 1,500 words total, right? Now you're already going to have, by the end of tomorrow, 1,000 words to start with, right? Which again, you will probably have to go back and revise some of that, but you're still not starting from scratch. So you're going to close through a single text, right? It means you're providing an interpretation of your chosen text, but it must be a focused interpretation that relates to a single important theme or idea. The draft is going to be 1,250 words, right? So that's what I'm shooting for the draft, right? So you'll be about 3/4 of the way to the 1,500 word paper by the time I get the draft. Now, what I want you to do for this, right? The formal requirements are all the same, right? Does anybody need to go over what I want you to do for citation, or is everybody pretty clear on how to do that by now? I don't think either of you have any problems with that on the exploratory reflection. Okay, so the big directions here are what comes on pages 2 and 3 here, right? So first off, you're choosing quotes that you think point to some bigger issue or idea in the text and that add up to some larger pattern, right? Now, one thing I do want to note, I think I've said this before, but it bears repeating. In the humanities, the norm is to quote, not to summarize or paraphrase, right? So I want to remind everybody that that is what I want you to do. I want you to quote directly, right? Explain what you take the quote to mean. And justify your explanation. Right? Justify your interpretation of the quote. So it might help if we think about this pattern we talked about last time. Claim, grounds, and warrant, right? Where the claim is your interpretation. The grounds is the material you're interpreting. And the warrant is the logical connection between the two.
So is grounds another word for data?
Yeah, grounds is basically data or evidence. Yeah, exactly. Grounds is just a specific word that Toolman uses in his model. It's data, evidence, it's all the same thing. Now, the way you're probably going to want to structure your paragraphs, right? Now, I do want you guys to quote directly, but you shouldn't start your paragraph with a quote. A paragraph should start with a claim and a little bit of context for that claim. The rest of the paragraph should then consist of evidence and your explanation of that evidence, right? So don't start or end a paragraph with a quote. You should start by explaining what you're going to be doing in this paragraph, right? Give me a topic sentence, and finish with your main interpretation of the piece of evidence you're looking at in the middle of the paragraph, Other things to note here, right? So, by and large, you're going to be doing with these texts the things you've started doing in your exploratory reflection and the things we've been doing in class, right? So you're going to be starting with close attention to particular words and sentences, right? Look for, implied meanings of words that are important. Be aware of ambiguous words, right? Words that can mean multiple different things. Look for potentially meaningful images and symbols. And look at the way various things throughout the text are connected, right? So, for example, we noticed when we looked at the Audre Lorde piece, which I think was what both of you chose to write about, right? Not only is there a pattern, relating to silence, right? But there are also these patterns relating to the body and to illness, right? And kind of like this relationship between silence and disease. So, the more things you can find in the text that you think are interconnected, right? The better your interpretation is going to be. And then you're going to try to put the pattern together, right? Once you've located this pattern, what does it all add up? What does it all add up to? And what's the significance of this particular pattern? Finally, you're going to want to make sure that you choose an appropriate interpretive context for your chosen text, right? That's usually what we do at the beginning of class when we start talking about the text. Right? We either talk about something to do with the historical period in which it was produced, or some kind of, philosophical or cultural trend that it relates to, right? So try to relate it back to something like that. And, there are a couple of points I've made here. The biggest point I want to make here is please do not use phrases like back in the day and in today's society, because those make me want to set myself on fire, okay? The draft is going to be due on Thursday. The paper is going to be due on the 23rd. So you are going to have the whole of the spring break to finish the paper, right? But by the time we leave on Thursday, you will already have significant amounts of the paper done. So you'll just be finishing it over the break. So go ahead. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions about anything so far? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the grading rubric here, right? What I'm looking for on this paper, right? So the requirements for each grade here go from D to A, right? You have to meet the requirements to get a D to get a C, the requirements to get a C to get a B, and so on and so forth, right? So in order to get the lowest possible passing grade on this paper, it has to be long enough, and you have to format it properly, and you can't cheat, right? That will get you a 60.
Yeah.
Now, if you actually address the assignments, if you demonstrate that you understood, at least on a basic literal level, the source that you're discussing, the sources are properly cited, and you advance a clear thesis, that'll get you a C, right? That'll get you at least a 70. If your argument is clear, consistent, and arranged effectively, we'll talk a little bit about how to do that today. If your primary source is actually quoted directly, if you do not treat opinion as fact, and you make effective and clear transitions between paragraphs, that'll be enough to give you a B, right? To get an A, your argument has to be original and nuanced, right? So a good, strong, original, interesting argument, even if it feels like you're going out on a limb, right? That's going to get you more points than a safe argument, right? If you are able to deal with evidence that contradicts or complicates your argument effectively, if you are able to balance effectively between argument and evidence, you are able to give me an argument that is properly contextualized and free of glaring historical errors. Telling me, for example, that George Washington came over on the Mayflower, right? No, right? Be careful with your history, right? And if it follows a single line of argument to its conclusion without digressions, right? So if everything contributes to advancing that thesis, right? That's how you will get an A on this paper.
So So do you want our thesis to be like our last sentence in the paper since you want us to like evidence and then your thesis?
That is actually exactly what we're going to talk about today. That is going to be our sort of our primary, and so we may as well just start that there, right, unless people have other questions about the grading rubric.
Yeah.
Okay, so the basic shape of a good paper is going to be kind of like a funnel.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to start with a relatively broad working thesis at the top of the funnel. And you are going to work your way down to a more specific, qualified version of that thesis in your conclusion. Now, the way you get there is by testing this original thesis in every paragraph against some piece of evidence, right?
What do you mean?
So you're going to come up with with an idea that you think explains the evidence you're looking at, right? And then when you apply more evidence to it, right, does that original idea still hold up? Or do you have to revise it in some way, right? So what I'm looking for here is for you to essentially show me your process of thinking through this particular question. So let me give you an example of how this works. Have either of you seen the movie Titanic?
Yes.
Okay, right. I actually hate the movie Titanic, but because it's something that generally everyone has seen, it usually works as a pretty good example for this particular.
I think it's a little cheesy.
It is extremely cheesy.
They could have, ended a little different. They could have both got on the thing.
Yeah, that was a big door, right?
Yeah, and there was plenty of other doors floating around.
Yeah, there's lots of debris there, right? Yeah, he didn't have to freeze to death in the water.
That's what I'm saying.
But yeah, I think, and we'll get to this, but I think it actually kind of is important for various reasons that he does freeze to death in the water. But let's start by looking at that love story at the center of the movie, right? Because it's not really a movie about a ship sinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ship sinking is largely incidental and happens because that's what history tells us.
Yeah, it's inevitable.
Yeah, what the movie is really about is this kind of doomed love story between these two characters, right? So who are our two star-crossed lovers here? What are their names?
You didn't say anything. Jane? Is her name? No? Rose.
Yep.
And Jack, yep.
Uh-huh.
I'm so slow.
Yeah.
No.
Can you get any more like typical
Basic?
names for people in a turn of the century boating disaster movie?
Off topic though, I don't see how Jack got to Europe in the first place. Because he was like, I'm going home in the beginning of the movie, and it was tickets, and I'm like, how did you even get there?
Yeah, well, and short answer, transatlantic travel used to be a lot cheaper. On a lot of ways, like it's now easier for us to get, like say to Europe than it used to be. You hop on a plane. But air travel is typically pretty expensive, all things considered. You could get yourself, to Europe or to East Asia from North America if you wanted to in the early 20th century, either by agreeing to work on a ship for your passage, or just by like paying for a really, really cheap room in the shittiest part of the ship.
Right.
So yeah, it was actually not that expensive to get across the ocean. Yeah, let's look at what these. So let's take a quick look first at these two characters, right? So what's Rose like? Let's start with her. What do we remember about Rose from however long ago we saw this
Very
movie?
high class.
Okay.
Has the finest things. Rich. She doesn't really have her own voice. She's being,
Okay.
dictated by her fiance or whatever he was.
Yeah, she's dominated by her fiance and her mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's engaged to a real piece of shit.
Right.
What else do we know about this character? She's high social status. She's dominated by these two other people, one of whom is a real jerk.
She falls really fast for Jack. Like, it takes her, like, almost
Okay.
no time to, like him.
Okay. Yeah, now, some of this is perhaps dictated by the running time of a Hollywood movie, right? Things have to proceed fairly quickly. Especially, when you've only got a set number of days before the ship sinks.
Right.
And, you have to deal with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, okay, she falls for Jack kind of fast, right? What do we know about Jack? What is Jack like? Does Jack have high social status?
No, he does not.
Yes, he is of the lower social orders, right?
Yes.
To the extent that he has a profession, what is it?
I couldn't tell you that one.
Yeah, it's hard to figure what exactly he does for a living, right? It seems like kind of a drifter, but he's also an artist, right?
Oh, yeah.
What else do we know about Jack, particularly if we compare him to Rose or contrast him with
He's
Rose?
kind of like free-spirited compared to Rose.
Okay.
Rose is kind of like, doesn't know how to express herself because she's never really had to.
Uh-huh.
But Jack, he's all out on the table.
Mm-hmm. So he is perhaps less constrained than she is by social expectations. And there is one really, really vital difference between the two that only really comes into play at the end of the movie.
Is it the age? No.
Well, they seem to be more or less the same age, right?
No.
How are they different at the end of the film?
Jack's willing to risk his life while Rose is just chilling on the
I think we're thinking along the right track here, right? But at the end of the movie, Rose is alive and Jack is dead, right?
Right.
So this part of it seems kind of like the anomaly here right now, right? The who lives, who dies. So, maybe we sit on that for a minute and see what we can do with it a little later, right? But let's look at everything else we've got here. We've got one character who is attached basically to nothing, right? And another who has all of these different social entanglements. How likely do we think it is these two would actually meet and fall in love on land?
Very unlikely.
Yeah, so something about, maybe kind of like the constrained nature of life on a ship, right, enables them to encounter each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's the, like, Titanic.
yeah.
Very extravagant.
Yeah, it's a big ship.
Yeah, it's just, liable for someone to fall in love.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's like if an episode of The Love Boat ended with icy death, right?
Right.
So, our first stab at a thesis here, right, might be something like, right, in the movie Titanic, the ship creates an enclosed social world in which cross-class relationships can flourish. Did I spell flourish right? I don't think so. Not that it matters, but it matters.
I mean, just, English teacher.
Yeah. I'm not really that kind of English teacher, but okay. So this looks like it accounts for what we've got here so far, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a good working thesis that we can start with. So let's start trying to apply a little bit more evidence for this, right? Do Jack and Rose run into each other and fall in love just due to everyday interactions on the ship?
No. He found her crying.
Just crying?
Like, it's been a minute.
She was going to jump off the ship, right?
Yeah.
So they actually meet in a place where no one is allowed to go, right?
Right.
They both snuck to he snuck into this place just to go look at the water or whatever, and she has snuck up there to try to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And he talks her out of it. They feed her family a line about him saving, saving her from accidentally falling off.
Yeah.
And that's good enough then, right? So they only managed to meet by violating the rules of the ship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we look at other situations in which they come into contact with each other's social classes, right? When Rose's family invites Jack to dinner to say thank you for stopping Rose from falling off the ship,
Mm-hmm.
How do they treat him?
Kind of below them.
Yeah, really kind of contemptuously, right? So he's treated with contempt by Rose's group. And what about when Rose goes down below decks with all, say, like the poor Irish immigrants with Jack? Does she really fit in there? Yeah, they're a lot nicer to her, right? But, she gets a little too drunk, she gets a little wild, right? Because, she's not used to this. So she doesn't fit in with Jack's world either. So this might lead us to rethink this original thesis, right? That while it may appear that Titanic encourages mixing of social classes, this mixing is only possible when characters break the ship's rules. Now we can take this a little further as well, right? If we look at, say the final hour or so of the movie, when the ship is sinking, Who gets the lifeboats?
Women and children?
All of the women and children?
No, just, it starts with, the high class and then works with low.
Yeah. By and large, it's the wealthier women and children who get the lifeboats, right? Because there are enough lifeboats on the ship for everybody. Because it's supposed to be unsinkable, right? What do you need lifeboats for?
Yeah.
And we see these kind of moments of heroism and self-sacrifice from various wealthy people on the ship, right? The old rich men who just go to smoke their cigars in the lounge, letting more women and children have their place on the boats, right?
That's playing, the band playing.
Yeah, the band who play for the benefit of the rich passengers, right? They're the only ones allowed in that dining room. Continues playing while the ship goes down. Which, okay, yeah, still, that's amazingly courageous, right? But we also see, the ship's crew locking the poor people down below decks, right? And, there's that, scene that, I remember when I saw this movie when I was in college, just, enraged me, where the Irish immigrant mother is putting her kids to sleep, knowing that none of them are going to wake up. Yeah. Yeah, I was spitting with rage, right? when I saw that, right? So I think we can also, so we have a movie here in which the rich are allowed to live and to be heroic, right? Whereas, yeah, and the poor are just kind of expected to die passively, right? So, the fact that Rose lives and Jack dies, right, even though there's plenty of room on that damn door, indicates that in the end, the movie still seems to value the rich girl more than the poor boy, right? Her life has been saved now twice. His life has been saved never. So we can come up with a more specific final version of this thesis, right? Which we would make part of our conclusion, right? In the end, by allowing Rose to live while Jack dies, the movie not only enforces existing class hierarchies, it values the lives and actions of the wealthy over those of the poor. And it is certainly possible for people to quibble with my lefty interpretation of this movie, right? This is just one way of reading all of this data. What I'm trying to demonstrate here primarily is not so much a reading of the movie as a method for reading a movie like this, or for reading any piece of material like this, right? The basic point here being that the more evidence you apply, the less likely it is your original broad thesis is going to survive, right?
So would our broad thesis be like the seems to be about X but could be about Y thing that we incorporate?
Yeah, you start with that, and then just start applying more evidence, right?
That was at the end of my first paragraph.
Well, and in general, that is where you're going to put your thesis, right? Yeah. Your first broad working thesis is going to be probably the last sentence of your first paragraph, right? Yeah. You give me some contextual information in your introduction, you give me that working thesis, and then each subsequent paragraph tests that thesis against more evidence, right? And that is how you work your way to this more specific, qualified version that you will discuss that you'll put in your conclusion, right? Any questions? Everybody with me? Great. So I do want to go over a little bit certain common types of weak thesis so that we know how to recognize them, we know how to deal with them, right? So a good thesis, like any good claim, because basically what a thesis is the controlling claim of your paper, right? The big claim that you're making. A good thesis needs to be arguable, and it needs to be sufficiently complex. Now here's what I mean by this, right? By arguable, I mean first, that it can be supported by evidence. Secondly, that it is possible for someone else to disagree with it. Right. If it is impossible for someone to disagree with your thesis, that means you're not making an argument, right? It means that you're just making an observation or a statement of fact. Now, by sufficiently complex, I mean that your thesis should hold two ideas in tension with each other. Right? Something that you're reacting against and your real interpretation. So, seems to be about X, right? Could also be about Y. Now, in the example that we just used, right, the X part is that initial reading of the class hierarchies, right? So, oh, hey, this movie looks like it allows different social classes to mix freely with each other, right? And then the Y part, my real argument is reacting against that, saying, like, actually, the movie clearly seems to value rich people more, right? So that should be the basic pattern you're going to want to follow when devising a thesis statement, right? You've got another possible interpretation you're reacting against, and then your interpretation, right? Now, here's how you recognize if you're not doing this. First example. In this paper, I will analyze Audre Lorde's definition of silence. What's wrong with this?
You just never start within this page.
What's that?
You just never start within this page. Within this page.
Okay. So part of it is a little bit of a formal no-no, right? Mm-hmm. The same reason, like, you never start your conclusion within conclusion, right?
Right.
You know, it's the last paragraph of the paper. I know what's your damn conclusion. But what's wrong with this on a deeper level? What is this thesis not doing?
Arguing anything. It's just a statement.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, you're saying, okay, this is the thing I'm going to look at, right? But you're not telling me what you're going to say about it, right? You're not taking any kind of position on it. So what you would need to do is raise a specific issue to discuss and take a position on it, right? So I might revise this to something like, you know, while Audre Lorde sees speaking out as a way of making ourselves vulnerable, she argues that silence makes us more vulnerable by robbing us of the chance to build communities. So now instead of just saying I'm going to talk about silence in Audre Lorde's essay, right? I'm saying something specific about how I think she treats silence and what I think she's doing with it, right? Right. This is arguable, this is not.
And you can back that second one up with her saying, like, my silence didn't protect me, yours won't protect you.
Exactly, yeah. Plus any number of other quotes I can take from the text, right? So all I've done here is told you like what on the base level I'm going to do, right? But I've given you no prediction as to what that's going to look like or what issues I'm really going to discuss in the paper. This isolates a specific issue, places it in tension with another idea in the essay, right? This idea of speaking out versus silence, right? What are the consequences of both? And yeah, it's something that is clearly argumentative, right? So you want to make sure that your thesis is taking a position on something, right? That you are actually arguing for or against something. All right, second example.
That top sentence was basically like a prompt.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a prompt rather than a thesis, yeah. Yeah, good observation.
I
All
was
right.
trying to think of that word this whole time.
All right, example 2. Rock music is primarily derived from Black American musical forms like the blues. What's wrong with this?
What? The blues are wrong. It's not arguable. It's a fact.
Yeah, this just is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is true. This is a fact. That you can't really quibble with this, right? You could argue the extent to which it's derived from the blues, right? But you can't argue that, yeah, that rock music is essentially, modified blues, right? So what we would need to do with this is find some complexity in the facts, right? Raise some specific question about the facts. So I can think about the relationship between rock music and the blues, right? And how this has developed historically, how it has affected the way audiences have received both, or even who listens to both, right? I can think about the way rock musicians have used the blues and whether or not it's, frankly ethical, right? So that is the tack I'm going to take here. And the way I'm going to revise this, right, is, again, thinking about the ethics of this, right? So, when white musicians adapted black musical styles in the 1950s and 1960s, it broke social taboos but also enforced existing racial hierarchies by allowing white musicians to profit from work done by black artists, right? So I have noted on the one hand, right, the conventional reading of rock music being derived from the blues and then kind of combined with country, right, to make something new. That it did actually break certain social boundaries, right? It did break social taboos. But I'm also pointing out a kind of ethical quandary that resulted from this, right? So I'm taking this fact and I'm thinking about it in terms of its broader effects on culture, right? Rather than just sort of taking the fact as something I can argue for or against. Does this make sense? Everybody got me?
So, like, you just explain what you're doing.
Okay, so I've taken the basic fact here, right? And while I haven't questioned the fact, right, I have tried to think about how the elements of this fact are related to each other, right? The things that we're talking about in this sentence, right? So, how is, so what, right? That predominantly white rock music is derived from predominantly black blues, right? And so what that rock has proven more popular over time than blues, right? And so what that rock musicians made so much more money than blues musicians did, right? Essentially what I've done here is taken this fact and asked a series of so what questions about it.
I hate that phrase.
I know, and it's an annoying phrase, but it's also an incredibly useful phrase, right?
Yeah.
This is what you should be asking yourself every time you write something down, right? Right? What is the significance of this? Right? Now, what is the significance of this is too long, right? So what is a good and convenient shorthand? All right, so we've had the non-argumentative statement. We've had the statement of fact. Now, let's go back to something kind of like Titanic. You hate the phrase, so what? I'm about to write down a phrase that makes me puke in my mouth a little bit. Romeo and Juliet's willingness to die for each other shows that love conquers all, even death. Oh, barf. Okay, so what's wrong with this? Okay, apart from being gross, right? Apart from the fact that this is a play in which two 13-year-olds are told by their parents to be kept apart. And so the reaction to it is to first run away and elope and then to commit mutual suicide, right? What else induces barfage in this phrase?
It's an opinion.
Okay, it is an opinion, right? But is there also something kind of formulaic about this? Maybe a particular use of words here that's a little too familiar?
Love conquers all.
Yeah. This is what we call a cliche.
Yeah, I was going to say it.
And a cliche is a kind of formulaic phrase that we tend to plug in when we don't have any ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are these kinds of conventional wisdom statements, right, that sound profound but are really usually just empty words. So the best way out of this trap, and everybody falls into it, right? Because you're pressed for time, you got to get something done, you got to get something on paper. So you fall back on something you know. Is to look for cracks, look for flaws in that conventional wisdom, right? How can we subvert this cliche? How can we break this cliche down? And I'm sure did you guys both have to read Romeo and Juliet in high school, so you're familiar with the play?
Yeah, 9th grade honors lit.
Okay. So let's think about what actually happens, particularly this last scene that we're talking about.
Well, doesn't Romeo think Juliet's dead and she's not, or is it the other way around? Like, he thinks she's dead, he kills himself, she comes back, she realizes that he's dead, and then she kills herself. Or is it like that?
I think it's the second.
So Juliet.
I think that he sees. I think that he sees her and thinks she's dead, and kills himself, and then she sees him.
Like she faked it
And
for her family.
yeah. Right. So they could run away together.
Right.
So yeah. So does this really seem like a situation of love doing anything good for anyone?
No, it's just like a little accident, like, oh.
Yeah. So if we actually break down what happens in the play, right? Does love conquer all, or does love make people behave stupidly, foolishly, and impulsively?
If it's even considered love that they have.
Yeah, it's basically just puberty hormones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Driving people crazy as they tend to do. So we can say that while Romeo and Juliet might appear to celebrate the intensity of young love, it actually suggests that love makes people behave foolishly, impulsively, and self-destructively. So here we've got a better, more accurate reading of what's going on in the play, right? That doesn't fall back on one of these cliches or these, this received wisdom, right? So whenever you find yourself writing a cliche like this, right, think about the cliche itself, right? Does this actually apply? Or am I just being lazy? Right? How can I break this silly cliche apart using material from whatever it is I'm looking at, right? Okay. 2 more examples of weak thesis statements, and then we'll move on. So for this one, I'm not even going to write a specific statement. I'll just show you what the basic mistake is. One thing that we can't do when we are analyzing any piece of text or a film or anything else, right, is analyze it solely in light of our own personal beliefs, right?
Don't be biased.
Yeah. Be objective, right? And try to understand the thing on its own terms. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't try to break the thing down and question it, right? But one thing that we have to remember is that when we look at something only through the prism of our own experience, we are liable to make mistakes about it, right? So I'm going to direct everybody to the story I told at the beginning of the semester, right? When those guys stopped next to me in their truck, and I thought they were going to fucking shoot me, when all they really wanted to do was ask me about my car, right?
Yeah.
So, in particular, like, I'm not saying don't have religious beliefs or political convictions, right? Everybody has them, right? Even non-belief is a form of belief, right? What I am saying is that you can't read everything that you look at in light of these things. Some things will lead themselves to particular kinds of religious or political readings, others will not. So make sure that whatever you are arguing is rooted in the evidence that you're looking at and not just your own personal beliefs. All right. And that should really kind of do it for that. Those are the basic weak thesis types, right? So if you're doing any of these things, right, learn to recognize it and learn, and correct it when you notice it, right? And again, like I am happy to help you with this. I'm happy to look over anything you're writing and to point out when you're doing these kinds of things. Okay, so what I'd like to do now with all of this is go back to what we were working on last time. So Ron, you were here, Gia, you were not. Gia, did you get a chance to look over I know you printed out the handout. Did you get a chance to look it over?
Yeah, I did. I watched the class last night.
Okay. Okay, so you have some sense of what we were doing, what was going on. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is try to go back to those claims that we were generating and see if we can work one or more of them into our real thesis statement, right? So Ron, can you remind us of kind of where we got to with your best claim last time?
The suburban did not like.
I wrote it down if you want me to say it.
Actually, yeah, if you had it written down, go for it.
I put, he said, people in suburban neighborhoods do not like construction around their homes. And then you added, because they fear the traffic that will result.
Okay. Gia, do you have claiming utilities. You do not. Okay. So let's use this as our starting point then, right? So Ron, which pieces of evidence did you use to generate this claim in the first place? Okay. So why don't we do this? Why don't we go back to the handout? Did you bring yours with you? Do you still have it?
No.
Okay, it's okay. I brought extras. Okay. And what I want us to do is look at all of these pieces of evidence that we have here in light of this claim, right? So we'll use this as our starting point. And now that we've got this as a starting point, okay, the people in suburban neighborhoods don't like new construction near their homes because they fear traffic, right? They don't want traffic. Let's look at how each piece of evidence relates to that and think about how we might revise this to account for more of this evidence, right? So take, say, maybe 5 minutes and tell me which pieces of evidence seem to directly relate to this already. And then we'll think about what we can do to revise this and rethink it.
So we're finding evidence from this to support that.
Yeah, which pieces of evidence seem already to support this?
Okay.
So what have we got here? What pieces of evidence do we think directly support this?
Well, the last one, definitely.
Okay. Right, so, yeah, the opposition to new construction point, okay. Now let's try to dig into that one a little bit more deeply here too, right? Now, people in suburban neighborhoods often oppose the building of new housing units, schools, hospitals or retail centers near their homes. Does anything seem weird about that? Do any of these things seem like bad things in and of themselves?
No, they're not like, no, they're not bad places that we're putting in.
Yeah. So this kind of, raises the question, right? Why do they oppose these generally useful things, right?
Because they'll take away their loan privileges
Well,
and add more traffic to their routes.
yeah, I think, adding more traffic is a definite key part of this, right? But I think maybe the walking issue is, like, given other pieces of evidence we have here, is it easy to walk in the suburbs anyway? Yeah, you already can't walk anywhere, right? One of the reasons traffic gets so bad is that you have to drive, right? So if we pair this with some of these other pieces of evidence, right, the lack of sidewalks after 1950, the proliferation of garages and carports, and if we look, at the idea, the average new American home in the early 1990s, right, the garage is as large as a living space. What does that suggest about car ownership? If people are building houses with even bigger garages.
They have more than one car.
Yeah, that most families have multiple cars as well, right? So, we can see from looking at some of these other pieces of evidence, right, that post-1950s America is predominantly suburban. That's where most new construction happens. And it is new construction that is very car-oriented, right? So let's see if we can find something to react against here, right? We can also see that there's something in the design of suburbs, the general design of suburbs, that creates traffic, right?
The feeder roads. What are feeder roads?
Okay, so yeah, the basic suburban development pattern looks something like this, right? You have a cul-de-sac, which is this kind of closed circular development pattern. Oh, okay, yeah, the Rosa Street's in here, right? And then there are usually only going to be, right, one or two entry points into that cul-de-sac, right?
Okay.
And then what it empties out onto is a feeder road that typically goes to a highway, right? So, I don't see how you just laughed at that, right? Why did this make you laugh?
I thought of my neighborhood.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, it's, I'm going to reveal some of my own biases here, right? But this is kind of a stupid development pattern, right? I mean, you're asking for traffic.
The way my neighborhood is set up is you go into it and you go straight, it goes to a cul-de-sac. If you turn and go straight, it goes to a cul-de-sac. And that's the road I live on.
Yeah.
And then there's a road that goes off of my road that's also a cul-de-sac.
Yeah. So you got multiple cul-de-sacs coming off of, yeah. I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood like this. Basically, the neighborhood I grew up on looked exactly like this. So the problem here seems to be perhaps one of design, right? Why would you develop a neighborhood this way? Why would you do it this way instead of having something like a grid pattern?
Would it be like safety for children?
Okay, that could be part of it, right?
Because they're not by a highway. They can see a car coming, and the car has to slow down because it's having a circle.
Yeah.
So.
Although, in a typical urban neighborhood, cars can't go that fast anyway, right? Because there are stoplights every block, and there's a lot of street parking, so people can't speed too much. What else might be a reason why you would build a neighborhood this way? How easy is it to get in and out of this? How easy is it to access any individual house here?
Fairly easy. I mean, I don't know, because there's only 2 rows.
Yeah, so you've got these two kind of bottlenecks coming in and out, right?
Yeah.
So you've made your neighborhood less accessible, right? Certainly not accessible to anybody who's not driving, for the sake of privacy, right? So when we look at these things together, we might draw the conclusion that while suburban homeowners desire greater privacy, this privacy is purchased at the expense of worse traffic. And we're running out of time, so we're not going to belabor this, but you can keep applying more pieces of evidence to this, right? And then we'll be able to develop a much more specific argument, right? The more evidence we're able to cover, the more evidence we're able to apply. We can do the same thing with this that we did when thinking about Titanic, right? Okay, anybody have any questions about anything?
Not at the moment.
All right. If you come up with something, email me.
Right.
All right. So we'll see you both on Tuesday then in the downstairs computer lab, and have yourselves a good weekend.